My dad had been gone less than 2 hours when my aunt texted, "If you leave the office this weekend, do not come back." She expected me to apologize and save her $1 million contract. She had no idea the very thing keeping her company alive never belonged to her. That night, I broke nothing. I simply took back what was mine. By morning, their entire empire began collapsing under the weight of the papers they signed. My name is Alice Lawson. I was standing in the aggressively sterile hallway of the local hospital, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing above me like a swarm of angry hornets. My hands were completely numb. In my right hand, I gripped a flimsy, clear plastic belongings bag. Inside it rested a worn leather wallet, a set of brass house keys, and a scratched silver wristwatch that had stopped ticking at exactly 2:14 in the afternoon. My father's watch. He had been gone for barely 2 hours. I had not even found the strength to call the funeral home yet. The pamphlets the sympathetic nurse had handed me felt like lead in my pocket. I was trying to remember how to breathe, how to put one foot in front of the other. When my phone vibrated sharply against my hip, I pulled it out, half expecting a message from one of his old neighbors. Instead, the screen lit up with a text from Evelyn Mercer. My aunt, the CEO of our so-called family business. I stared at the screen, my tear-blurred eyes struggling to focus on the block of text. There were no condolences, not a single word acknowledging that her own brother, my father, had just taken his last breath. Instead, her message was a masterclass in corporate cruelty. She demanded I return to the office immediately. She reminded me that we had a massive, multi-million-dollar contract rollout scheduled for this weekend. Then came the ultimatum, delivered with the casual brutality she was famous for. If I dared to take 4 days off to arrange and attend my own father's funeral, I would be permanently stripped of my role. Furthermore, she threatened to have the family lawyers sever my remaining beneficiary rights to my grandfather's trust fund. The message ended with a cold, absolute directive. If I left the building for this weekend, I should not bother coming back. The sheer audacity of it hit me like a physical blow. For a brief second, the breath was knocked out of me. I leaned against the cool plaster of the hospital wall, the plastic bag crinkling loudly in the quiet corridor. A wave of familiar, sickening guilt washed over me. The ingrained instinct to apologize, to rush back to my desk, to fix whatever disaster was brewing so I could earn my keep. It was the same toxic cycle I had been trapped in for over a decade. But then, the grief gave way to something else, something cold and sharp. I read the message a second time, and then a third. The shock began to recede, replaced by a sudden, jarring clarity. Evelyn was a narcissist, yes, but she was usually a calculated one. This text was erratic. It was dripping with an arrogant authority. But beneath the threats, I could hear the distinct, shrill pitch of desperation. She was not just angry about losing a staff member for a few days. She was terrified. She was panicking over something much larger than a delayed schedule. At 34 years old, I was officially listed on the company directory as the Operations and Compliance Manager. To the outside world, Mercer Ridge Infrastructure Group was a glittering titan of industry. We supplied heavy materials and orchestrated complex delivery logistics for massive urban infrastructure projects. We had the sleek glass headquarters downtown, the glossy brochures, and the impeccably tailored executives. Evelyn sat on the Iron Throne as Chief Executive Officer. Her son, my cousin Kyle Mercer, paraded around with the title of Vice President of Operations. In reality, Kyle's primary job consisted of showing up late, barking contradictory orders at the warehouse staff, playing golf with prospective clients, and eagerly taking the credit whenever a project finished under budget. They were the face of the empire, but I was the spine. They never understood that, or rather, they actively chose to ignore it. The title on my office door was a joke. I was the architect of their entire operational reality. I built the routing software systems from scratch. I wrote every single compliance protocol. I maintained the vast, tangled network of subcontractors. I personally designed the digital delivery handover chain that satisfied the relentless audits of our state contracts. For years, I had allowed them to abuse my work ethic. Whenever I asked for a raise, or a promotion, or simply the basic professional recognition that my contributions warranted, Evelyn would expertly deploy the guilt trip. She would lean across her mahogany desk, clasp her manicured hands, and remind me that family helps family. She would say we were building a legacy together. She would mention how much the company did for me, completely ignoring the fact that I was routinely working 80-hour weeks to keep her disorganized son from accidentally bankrupting us through sheer negligence. I was their permanent, unpaid fixer, the quiet niece who could always be bullied into staying until midnight to rewrite the compliance bids that Kyle had botched. I swallowed the disrespect because I craved the illusion of family loyalty. I desperately wanted to believe that if I just worked hard enough, if I was just useful enough, they would eventually respect me. Standing in that hospital corridor, holding the meager remnants of my father's life in a plastic bag, that illusion shattered completely. My father was dead, and my aunt was using my grief as leverage to ensure her weekend deliverables were met. The sheer, blinding disrespect burned away any lingering loyalty I had left. I looked down at the phone in my hand, the screen now dark. A strange, calm silence settled over my mind. The panic Evelyn was trying to instill in me simply vanished. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and gripped the plastic bag a little tighter. They truly believed they had all the power. They thought I was just an obedient employee easily controlled by the threat of unemployment and financial ruin. What they were actually threatening was the only person who knew exactly where the cracks in their empire were hidden. My father, Thomas Lawson, was not a man built for the polished glass corridors of corporate empires. Long before the sleek headquarters and the glossy brochures existed, he was one of the original co-founders of the material transport division that birthed the family wealth. But he walked away. He packed up his life and left his own sister behind after a catastrophic, relationship-ending fight over basic business ethics. Evelyn wanted aggressive expansion at any cost, while my father refused to compromise his integrity. After severing ties with the company, he retreated to Maple Creek, a quiet, blue-collar town where the air smelled of pine and diesel. There, he opened a modest repair shop for air compressors and heavy construction tools. He traded boardrooms for a workbench scarred by years of hard labor. He lived a life of deliberate simplicity. He was a man of few words, but his silence carried a weight that Evelyn's constant shouting never could. To my father, a promise was an ironclad bond, and a signature was a measure of a person's soul. He was the one who taught me how to survive in the world of business, though he never intended for me to use those skills for the people who pushed him out. We spent countless evenings in his dusty shop, the glow of a solitary desk lamp illuminating stacks of paper. He taught me to read every single contract with a bright red pen in my hand. He made me track every invoice, cross-reference every delivery receipt, and never, ever take a verbal agreement at face value. I can still hear his deep, gravelly voice echoing over the hum of a repaired generator. He would point that red pen at me and say that the loudest talker usually has the weakest paperwork. Naturally, the Mercer side of the family despised him for his principles. In Evelyn's grand dining room, between sips of expensive wine, they openly referred to him as a stubborn failure. They mocked his grease-stained hands and his tiny shop, but I knew the truth. They called him a failure because, many years ago, he flatly refused to sign off on a batch of highly questionable, deliberately murky acceptance reports that Evelyn needed to secure a sketchy loan. His refusal almost cost her the business, but it kept him out of a federal courtroom. They hated him because he could not be bought. When I graduated, I foolishly thought I could mend the fractured family dynamic. I became the reluctant, exhausted bridge spanning two entirely different worlds. By day, I navigated the venomous, high-stakes politics of the family business, wearing sharp suits and fixing Kyle's expensive mistakes. By night, I would drive 45 minutes out to Maple Creek, change into old jeans, and sit on a wobbly stool in my father's shop. I would listen to him recount stories from the old construction sites, the honest dirt, the camaraderie of men who built things with their hands instead of destroying things with their lawyers. Over the last 8 months, as the illness slowly hollowed him out, those evening visits became my only sanctuary. His voice grew weaker, but his mind remained terrifyingly sharp. From his armchair, wrapped in a faded plaid blanket, he would watch me rubbing my temples after another brutal 14-hour shift. He would grab my hand, his grip surprisingly firm, and issue warnings I was too scared to heed. He told me to stop letting them weaponize the word family. He warned me that Evelyn and Kyle would drain my youth, my energy, and my soul, using bloodlines to force me into sacrificing my own life for their profit margins. I should have listened, I confess, with a heavy heart, that I ignored every boundary he tried to help me set. I kept giving them more of my time, my intellectual property, and my sanity. Deep down, in some pathetic, broken part of my inner child, I genuinely believed that if I just performed flawlessly, if I saved them from disaster just one more time, my aunt and cousin would finally look at me with genuine respect. I thought they would eventually pull out a chair for me at the head table, but that invitation never arrived. The reality of my position was never clearer than it was during Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. Evelyn was hosting at her sprawling, multi-million-dollar estate. The dining room was a sea of crystal glasses, roasted meats, and roaring laughter. But I was not sitting at the table. I was banished to the kitchen island, a cold plate of food pushed to the side, my laptop open and glowing harshly against the warm, ambient light. Kyle had completely botched a crucial, time-sensitive bid proposal for a municipal water project. If it was not submitted by midnight, we would lose millions. So, while the rest of the family clinked their glasses and shared stories, I frantically rewrote 90 pages of technical specifications and compliance mandates. I typed until my fingers ached. Through the swinging kitchen door, I could see Kyle standing up at the head of the table. He raised his glass of champagne, soaking up the applause and praise from his mother and their wealthy friends for securing the preliminary negotiations of that very same project. He took the credit, while I sat in the background, making sure he did not go to jail for fraud. I was the hired help, paying for the privilege of being related to them. Standing here now in the freezing hospital corridor, the harsh reality of those memories crashed over me. I looked down at the flimsy plastic bag in my hand, the scratched silver watch, the worn leather wallet, the sum total of a fiercely honest man's physical possessions. The text message from Evelyn burned in my mind. She wanted me back at my desk. She wanted me to abandon the man who taught me how to defend myself, all to save her weekend rollout. This was not merely a dispute over requesting 4 days of bereavement leave. The scales had finally fallen from my eyes. This was the ultimate, unavoidable crossroads. For the very first time in my entire life, I was being forced to make a definitive choice. I had to choose between honoring the legacy and the quiet dignity of my father, or continuing to serve as the silent, abused engine inside their relentless, soul-crushing money machine. And as my grip tightened on his old brass house keys, I knew exactly which path I was about to take. I pushed through the revolving glass doors of Mercer Ridge headquarters, the polished chrome and marble feeling entirely alien after the antiseptic chill of the ward. The lobby buzzed with the usual Friday afternoon frenzy, but I felt entirely detached from it. I bypassed my cubicle, a cramped, windowless box where I had spent thousands of uncompensated overtime hours, and marched straight toward the executive suites on the top floor. I was not there to fix a spreadsheet. I was there to draw a hard line in the sand. I found them in the main glass-walled conference room overlooking the city skyline. Evelyn sat at the head of the long, custom-built mahogany table, flanked by Kyle and 2 mid-level logistics managers who always looked perpetually terrified of losing their jobs. I walked in without knocking. The heavy glass door shut behind me, sealing us in a soundproof vacuum of corporate tension. I reached into my bag, pulled out a glossy, tri-fold funeral home brochure, and placed it directly in the center of the table, right on top of their printed weekend rollout agendas. The brightly colored floral arrangement printed on the cover looked entirely absurd against the stark black and white data sets. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of the tremor that had shaken me an hour ago. I stated clearly that I required exactly 4 days to arrange the memorial services, handle the immediate estate matters, and bury my father. I assured them that upon my return on Tuesday morning, I would execute a comprehensive, orderly handover of my current compliance duties to anyone they designated. It was a professional, highly reasonable proposition given the circumstances. Evelyn did not even glance at the brochure. She leaned back in her high-backed leather executive chair, steepling her manicured fingers. Her face was a masterclass in cold contempt. She looked past me to the two managers, sighing loudly and rolling her eyes, as if I were a petulant toddler throwing a tantrum over a broken toy. She actually had the nerve to use the phrase ill-timed personal drama to describe my father's death. She declared, in a voice dripping with condescension, that the company could absolutely not afford to halt essential operations just because I was feeling emotional and needed a break. Kyle, always emboldened by his mother's cruelty, leaned forward, aggressively invading my personal space across the table. He scoffed. Adjusting the expensive cuffs of his custom-tailored shirt, he confidently declared that everyone loses relatives, waving his hand as if a parent passing away was a minor logistical inconvenience akin to a delayed flight. He loudly reminded the room that they were exactly 48 hours away from the massive mobilization phase of the Crown Harbor floodwall package, a government-backed infrastructure project worth exactly $6.4 million. I tuned out Kyle's arrogant blustering and focused entirely on Evelyn. I had spent over a decade analyzing this woman's behavioral tics, and right then, she was broadcasting a massive, systemic internal failure. While Kyle ran his mouth about profit margins, Evelyn's right hand kept creeping up to her face. She was obsessively rubbing her jawline, her fingernails digging so hard into her skin they left pale half-moons. When she reached for her crystal water glass, the liquid inside trembled noticeably before she quickly set it back down. She was not just annoyed about a minor scheduling conflict or an absent employee. She was deeply, profoundly terrified. My mind instantly shifted gears. Dropping the heavy cloak of grief and entering the hyper-analytical mode that made me so dangerously valuable to them, I mentally mapped the entire legal architecture of the Crown Harbor deal. The $6.4 million payout was not guaranteed cash. It was entirely contingent upon performance. It was inextricably linked to incredibly strict commercial bank covenants and brutal surety bonding requirements. If the weekend mobilization failed to meet the exact stringent compliance milestones, the bonding company would immediately flag the project as a high risk. If the bond was flagged, the commercial bank would automatically freeze Mercer Ridge's entire operational credit line by Monday morning to mitigate their exposure. But that was only half the puzzle, the real secret. The critical structural flaw they had completely overlooked in their arrogance was how those complex compliance milestones were actually generated and verified. Every single digital signature required for the state auditors, every automated process template guiding the warehouse loaders, the entire GPS delivery tracking system, and the proprietary network of vetted transport partners did not legally belong to Mercer Ridge Infrastructure Group. They belonged entirely to my private entity. I had incorporated a separate limited liability company 5 years ago to develop the software and compliance protocols because Evelyn had flatly refused to allocate a single dime of the corporate budget for operational upgrades. Because I foolishly trusted my blood relatives back then, I had allowed them to lease the entire digital ecosystem for practically nothing. The only thing binding our two entities was a dense, boilerplate master licensing agreement, tucked away in my locked filing cabinet. It contained a unilateral termination clause for breach of faith that absolutely no one in this glass building had ever bothered to read. They sat there, completely deluded, thinking they owned the machinery that printed their money. They only rented the keys, and the landlord was standing right in front of them, holding a funeral brochure. Sensing my unwavering silence, Evelyn slammed her trembling hand flat against the mahogany table. Startling the two managers so badly, one of them dropped his silver pen. She delivered her final, desperate ultimatum. She stated with absolute venom that if I walked out of that glass room today, She would personally instruct the accounting department to instantly revoke all my administrative access and withhold my final paycheck. She promised to circulate a memo to our entire vendor network, claiming I had willfully abandoned my post during a critical corporate emergency, ensuring I would never work in the logistics industry again. Finally, she leaned in, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper, threatening to have the estate lawyers completely erase my name from my grandfather's trust fund by the end of the day. The two managers stared intensely at their laptops, desperately refusing to make eye contact with anyone, silently praying to be invisible. Kyle smirked, looking incredibly proud of his mother's ruthless ambush. The silence stretched tight across the room, humming with the vibration of the air conditioning unit overhead. I felt no fear. I felt no sorrow. I just looked at the woman who had exploited me, demeaned me, and casually insulted the man who had just taken his last breath. The power dynamic in the room had just violently inverted, and I was the only one who knew it. I reached out, calmly picked up the floral funeral home brochure, and slid it neatly into my purse. I looked straight into Evelyn's panicked, dilated eyes. "Then you had better pray your paperwork is clean," I said. I turned my back on them, opened the heavy glass door, and walked out without looking back. The drive from downtown to Maple Creek took exactly 47 minutes, but it felt like crossing into another dimension. I parked my car on the gravel driveway outside my father's old workshop. The air out here was still and quiet, devoid of the frantic hum of the city. I unlocked the heavy steel door and stepped inside. It smelled of motor oil, aged wood, and him. I did not turn on the main overhead fluorescents. Instead, I walked over to his heavy oak workbench, nestled between two dented metal filing cabinets, and flicked on the battered brass desk lamp he always used when repairing delicate pneumatic tools. The warm pool of yellow light illuminated the scarred wood. I sat down on his wobbly stool. I was not crying anymore. The well of grief had temporarily frozen over, leaving behind a crystalline, absolute focus. I opened my laptop and let his most important lesson guide my hands. Read the contract before you react. I pulled up the master licensing agreement between my private entity, Lawson Field Systems Limited Liability Company, and Mercer Ridge. It was a dense, 70-page document I had drafted 5 years ago. It clearly outlined that my company owned the proprietary route management software, the automated compliance templates, the delivery confirmation portal, and the entire secure document data warehouse. Mercer Ridge was merely a licensee, permitted to use the architecture under strict conditions. I opened the back-end server logs to verify the current usage metrics before initiating the lockdown. That was when I saw it. The anomaly stuck out against the lines of code like a flare in the dark. Exactly 7 days ago, a critical compliance addendum regarding soil density standards for a separate municipal project had been generated, finalized, and transmitted to a state auditor. The document bore my cryptographic digital signature. The system recorded that my unique authorization token had verified the release at 3:14 in the afternoon. There was just one massive problem. At 3:14 last Friday afternoon, I was sitting next to my father in the oncology ward, holding his hand while he slept, my laptop locked in the trunk of my car. Someone at the corporate office had cloned or bypassed my authorization token. They had forged my digital signature to push through a compliance document that I had never reviewed, let alone approved. This was not just a lazy shortcut. In the realm of state-funded infrastructure, it was a severe federal offense, and if they had done it once, there was a strong chance they had done it before. Evelyn's panicked behavior in the conference room suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. She knew about the forgery. She was terrified that if I took 4 days off and handed over my duties to a third party, someone else would notice the discrepancy in the audit trails. She needed me chained to my desk, too overworked and exhausted to check the historical logs, until the massive weekend rollout was completed and the trail could be buried under thousands of new data points. A lesser person might have reacted with rage. They might have logged in as the super administrator and deleted the entire database, crashing the company servers into oblivion. But that would be digital vandalism. That would give Evelyn the exact legal ammunition she needed to have me arrested and sued into bankruptcy. I was my father's daughter. I was going to do this clean, precise, and entirely by the book. I opened a new window and began executing a series of highly calculated, entirely legal administrative actions based squarely on the breach of contract clause. First, I drafted a formal notice of immediate termination of usage rights due to a critical violation of the security and authentication protocols. I emailed it directly to Evelyn, Kyle, and the Mercer Ridge General Legal inbox. Next, I accessed the central license server with 3 keystrokes. I revoked the active enterprise license key. I did not shut down their access to the historical data. The system did not crash, nor did their screens suddenly go black. I simply shifted the entire Mercer Ridge operational portal into a strict read-only mode. The logistics managers could still log in. They could view every past invoice, every completed route, and every archived blueprint. However, the execution functions were instantly paralyzed. If they tried to generate a new compliance packet for the weekend mobilization, the button would be grayed out. If a warehouse foreman tried to print a digitally verified load manifest so a truck could legally leave the yard, the system would politely deny the request. Without my software generating the mandated, traceable paperwork, not a single piece of heavy machinery or load of concrete could legally exit the gates. But shutting them out was only the tactical strike. I needed to secure the perimeter. I spent the next hour drafting formal evidence preservation notices. I sent the first one to my private attorney, attaching the server logs showing the forged signature. I sent the second one to the third-party cloud hosting provider, legally compelling them to freeze the current server state to prevent Kyle or his IT technicians from attempting to scrub the access logs. The final preservation notice was the decisive move. I sent it directly to the chief risk officer of the surety bonding company, underwriting the massive weekend project. I stated simply that as the software proprietor, I had detected unauthorized access and a potentially forged compliance signature originating from a Mercer Ridge IP address, and I was freezing the system to conduct a forensic audit. I closed my laptop. I did not call the Mercer Ridge Board of Directors. I didn't need to. The beauty of the trap I had just sprung was that the rest would now unfold without me lifting another finger. Tomorrow morning, when the trucks failed to roll, the subcontractors would panic, the site managers would scream at Kyle, the bonding company would demand answers from Evelyn, the pressure from the external ecosystem would crush the glass walls of their corporate sanctuary inward, forcing the ugly truth out into the open for the board to see. Outside the workshop, the sky had bruised into a deep purple, and a cold. Steady rain began to drum against the tin roof. The rhythmic sound was peaceful, a stark contrast to the sudden, violent vibration against the wood. I looked down. My phone, sitting next to my father's old lamp, was lighting up the dark desk. The screen flashed frantically with incoming calls from Kyle, then Evelyn, then the head of dispatch. The vibrations rattled against the oak like an air raid siren from the glittering tower I had just left behind. I watched it dance on the wood for a moment, then calmly reached over and turned the device completely off. I had kept my primary phone switched off for 3 hours. When I finally powered it back on, the screen instantly froze, choked by a torrential flood of notifications. 74 missed calls, 112 unread text messages. Voicemails stacked up so fast, the carrier's voicemail system stopped accepting new messages. The first wave of panic had come from the ground floor. The lead dispatcher had called 12 times in 10 minutes. The night shift warehouse foreman had left frantic voicemails pleading for a system override. The lead driver for the heavy transport fleet texted a picture of 18 huge trucks lined up at the main loading gate, their engines idling, unable to receive their digitally verified dispatch manifests. Without those specific files, the concrete barricades and steel rebar meant for the government project were legally trapped on Mercer Ridge asphalt. Then came Kyle. His messages were a chaotic string of uppercase letters, radiating the frantic energy of a man watching his career evaporate. He accused me of intentional corporate sabotage. He threatened to drag me into a civil courtroom and sue me for millions. He claimed he was currently on the phone with the district attorney to file criminal charges for digital property theft. I did not block him. I simply typed out a single, precise reply and hit send. I stated that all usage rights had been permanently revoked due to a material breach of the master licensing agreement. I added that if the company required emergency operational support, they would need to have their legal counsel contact mine to negotiate a new, independent contracting rate and pay a substantial consulting retainer up front. Less than 2 minutes later, my phone rang again. It was Evelyn. I swiped to accept the call and pressed the device to my ear, remaining completely silent. The background noise on her end was a symphony of corporate disaster. I could hear phones ringing off the hook, muffled shouting from the logistics floor, and the unmistakable sound of Kyle swearing loudly at a logistics coordinator. Evelyn did not lead with her usual arrogance. She started with a velvet tone, a desperate imitation of maternal warmth. She begged me to be reasonable. She promised an immediate salary increase, retroactive to the beginning of the fiscal year. She offered me a new title, but when I remained silent, the velvet quickly burned away, revealing the jagged edge of her true nature. The promises morphed back into threats. She shifted her attack to my father, her voice dripping with venom. She called him a weak man who had always dragged the entire family down. Claiming he had poisoned my mind against my own blood, I let her talk. I let her expend her energy, listening as her breathing grew ragged and her voice cracked under the mounting pressure of the failing supply chain. When she finally paused to take a breath, I delivered the single question I had been holding on to. Who used my digital signature on the compliance addendum last Friday? The effect was instantaneous. The background chaos on her end of the line seemed to vanish, swallowed by a profound, suffocating silence. I could hear the faint, rapid intake of her breath. She did not yell. She did not deny it. She did not launch into a defensive tirade. For exactly 4 seconds, there was nothing but the heavy, guilty static of an open cellular connection. Then, she hung up. That abrupt click was a louder confession than any spoken word. I had struck the exact nerve keeping her empire together. Through a secondary read-only portal I had kept open on my laptop, I watched the chaos metastasize across their network in real time. The operational freeze was bleeding directly into the financial arteries of the company. The receiving managers at the Crown Harbor site were electronically flagging the delayed shipments, which automatically triggered preliminary breach of schedule warnings. Meanwhile, the Mercer Ridge accounting department was hitting a massive firewall. I watched their internal dashboard flash red as several massive outgoing payment orders were automatically blocked by the banking software. The bank required valid, verified matching documents to disburse funds to the subcontractors. Because my system was no longer authenticating the delivery stages, the accountants had zero proof of progress. The cash flow was officially severed. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message on an encrypted messaging application from a veteran logistics manager I had quietly helped out of a few binds over the years. His message was brief but critical. He warned me that Evelyn had locked herself, Kyle, and the senior legal counsel in the main conference room. They were frantically trying to construct a narrative to present to the board of directors tomorrow morning. Their entire strategy was to frame me as an unstable, grieving daughter who had suffered a psychological break and maliciously hijacked the company servers. They were going to try to destroy my professional reputation to cover up their federal fraud. I exhaled slowly, letting the cold air of the workshop fill my lungs. I was not afraid. I was simply exhausted by their predictable, endless cruelty. I pushed my chair away from the workbench and stood up, my joints stiff from sitting for so long. I walked toward the back of the shop, where my father kept his most vital, personal tools. Tucked beneath a heavy canvas dropcloth on the bottom shelf of a metal rack was a battered steel lockbox. He had given me the combination a month ago. His voice weak, but his eyes intensely serious. I knelt on the concrete floor, the damp chill seeping through my jeans. I spun the dial. 3 turns to the right, 2 to the left, 1 to the right. The heavy latch snapped open with a sharp, metallic clack. Inside, nestled among old photographs, a faded military service medal, and the original deed to the workshop, was a thick manila envelope. It was not sealed. Written across the front, in my father's unmistakable, blocky handwriting, was a single directive: only open when they force you to choose between family and conscience. My hands trembled, not from sorrow, but from the electric shock of anticipation. My father had known this day would come. He had known Evelyn would eventually push me to the edge of the cliff. He had left me something to fight back with. I carefully lifted the envelope from the box, feeling the heavy weight of the documents inside, ready to see what final weapon he had hidden away from me. The sky over Maple Creek was barely bleeding into a bruised purple dawn when the crunch of heavy tires on gravel broke the silence. Red and blue lights strobed across the frosted windows of the workshop. I had been sitting at the oak bench for 6 straight hours, drinking black coffee, waiting for them. Evelyn was nothing if not predictable. When intimidation failed, she always escalated to authority. I unlocked the heavy steel door before they even had a chance to knock. 2 local police officers stood on the porch, their breath pluming in the freezing morning air. The lead officer, a tall man with a hardened jawline and his hand resting casually near his duty belt, looked me up and down. He asked if I was Alice Lawson. When I confirmed, his tone turned rigid, carrying the weight of an official inquiry. He stated they had received an urgent dispatch regarding a disgruntled employee illegally seizing company equipment, hijacking digital infrastructure, and actively causing millions of dollars in corporate damages to Mercer Ridge. I stepped aside and invited them in out of the cold. I did not raise my voice. I did not act defensive. I walked directly over to my father's desk and picked up a thick black binder I had spent the dark hours of the early morning assembling. The officer crossed his arms, expecting a tearful breakdown or an angry denial. Instead, I handed him the open binder. The very first page was the official state registration for Lawson Field Systems, naming me as the sole proprietor. The second page was the master licensing agreement, signed 5 years ago by Evelyn herself, clearly defining my company as the exclusive owner of the servers, the software, and all associated intellectual property. I kept my voice perfectly level, the tone of a professional conducting a routine audit. I explained that I was not an employee seizing company assets, but an independent vendor enforcing a legal termination clause due to a severe breach of contract. The officer skimmed the legal jargon, his aggressive posture visibly softening. He frowned, looking from the paperwork to me. He mentioned that the caller claimed I had deleted critical operational databases. Before I could answer, the radio clip to his shoulder buzzed, and the dispatcher relayed that the complainant was holding on a patched line. Demanding an update, the officer pulled his handheld radio and switched it to speaker. Evelyn's voice filled the quiet workshop, distorted but dripping with manufactured maternal concern. She told the officer that her niece was going through a terrible tragedy. Having lost her father just yesterday, she painted a picture of a young woman completely out of control with grief, suffering a psychological break and lashing out at her own family by sabotaging the company network. It was a calculated, vicious tactic designed to completely strip away my credibility in the eyes of law enforcement. I did not take the bait. I did not defend my mental state or address her cruel manipulation of my father's death. Emotional arguments hold no weight in a legal standoff. Instead, I simply turned the next page in the binder. I pointed to a freshly printed email from the third-party cloud data host, time-stamped just hours ago. It was an official verification report. I calmly informed the officer that the email proved absolutely zero data had been deleted or destroyed. The entire network had merely been reverted to a read-only status, strictly preserving the data architecture in its exact current state. I stated, speaking loudly enough for the radio microphone to pick it up, that I was legally preserving the digital evidence because I had uncovered a forged digital signature used to bypass federal compliance regulations, and I was preparing to hand the logs over to a federal auditor. The silence that followed from the radio was absolute. Evelyn did not say another word. The lead officer stared at the cloud host email, then looked at the state registration, and finally looked at me. He recognized a bulletproof legal defense when he saw one. He unclipped his radio, stated sharply into the receiver that there was no criminal activity present, and abruptly ended the transmission. He handed the binder back to me. His demeanor entirely shifted from an enforcer to a neutral observer. He apologized for the intrusion, stating clearly that this was strictly a civil and commercial dispute, completely outside their jurisdiction. Before walking out the door, he instructed his partner to file a formal warning to Mercer Ridge against abusing emergency dispatch lines to handle private contract negotiations. The cruisers backed out of the driveway, their flashing lights cutting out, leaving the workshop in the quiet, pale light of morning. I locked the door, went back to the workbench, and finally reached for the manila envelope I had pulled from my father's lockbox the night before. The adrenaline of the police encounter faded, leaving a sharp, focused curiosity. I carefully unspooled the red string tying the envelope shut and slid the contents onto the scarred wood. It was a small stack of ancient, yellowed papers, brittle at the edges, smelling of dust and time. The top document was a formalized capital contribution agreement, dated nearly 3 decades ago. I scanned the typed text, my eyes snagging on the financial figures. It outlined a massive, personal cash injection into Mercer Ridge, secured against the very workshop I was standing in, along with my father's original transport trucks and personal savings. Attached to the back with a rusted paperclip was a piece of lined notebook paper covered in my father's handwriting. The ink was faded, but the words hit me like a physical blow. He wrote that when Evelyn had nearly bankrupted the company during her first year at the helm through reckless expansion, he had liquidated his own assets to save her from ruin, but the twist, the poison pill he had carried in silence for years, was in the second paragraph. After their final, explosive argument, when he walked away, he suspected Evelyn had deliberately manipulated the internal corporate restructuring. She had not just bought him out, she had legally buried the origin of that capital injection, entirely erasing the debt she owed him and absorbing his equity into her own majority share. I stood frozen, staring at the handwritten note. The ground beneath the entire conflict violently shifted. This was no longer just about a software lease. It was not just about the 4 days of bereavement leave, or even the forged signature on the compliance documents. Evelyn had stolen the very bedrock of the company from my father, using his money to build her glass tower while he toiled away in this dusty workshop until the day he died. Taking it all back meant something entirely different now. It meant taking the company itself. By exactly 8 a.m. on Saturday, the precise moment the heavy transport fleet was scheduled to break ground at the waterfront, the final thread snapped. I was sitting at my father's desk, a fresh cup of black coffee warming my hands, watching the digital dashboard I had left open. The server traffic remained dead flat. No documents generated, no manifest signed. Right on cue, the project managers for the Crown Harbor waterfront expansion realized their inboxes were empty. Government infrastructure projects do not operate on promises. They operate on verified paper trails. Without the mandated compliance packets, they immediately triggered the severe schedule breach protocols. They bypassed the Mercer Ridge logistics floor entirely and dialed directly into the executive board of directors. I experienced the ensuing explosion through a series of encrypted messages from the veteran dispatch manager, the same man who had tipped me off the night before. He was sitting in the corner of the emergency boardroom meeting, ostensibly there to provide operational updates, but practically serving as my eyes and ears. Evelyn convened the emergency session with frantic speed. According to my contact, she stood at the head of the long table, playing the victim with practiced ease. She spun a dramatic narrative, claiming her emotionally unstable niece had completely abandoned her post during a critical corporate crisis and was now maliciously holding the entire proprietary system hostage for a massive ransom. It was a desperate attempt to frame the catastrophe as a bizarre, isolated family dispute rather than a systemic failure. But her narrative began disintegrating within minutes. The board demanded answers. instructing the internal legal department to immediately execute an injunction against me to reclaim their software. The senior corporate counsel opened his laptop, pulled up the vendor files, and went completely pale. He had to clear his throat twice before informing the room full of furious investors that Mercer Ridge could not file an injunction to reclaim the system, because Mercer Ridge did not actually own it. He read the master licensing agreement aloud, officially confirming that the entire routing architecture, the compliance templates, and the data warehouse belonged 100% to Lawson Field Systems, my independent limited liability company. Evelyn had spent years falsely reporting those assets as proprietary company property to inflate their corporate valuation. The temperature in the room plummeted, but the true fatal blow landed exactly 12 minutes later. The board secretary interrupted the shouting match to project an urgent incoming email onto the main screen. It was not from a client. It was from the chief risk officer of the massive surety firm underwriting the multi-million-dollar waterfront bond. They were formally demanding an immediate, sworn explanation regarding a notification they had received from me hours earlier, which flagged a potentially forged digital signature on state compliance documents. In an instant, the atmosphere in the boardroom shifted from an operational headache to a catastrophic legal nightmare. A delayed shipment was a financial penalty. A forged signature on a federally backed project was a criminal indictment. Kyle, sweating profusely in his expensive suit, tried to throw his own mother a lifeline. He stood up, stammering wildly, and attempted to blame the former compliance department. He waved his hands, insisting the forged document was merely a technical misunderstanding, a glitch in the legacy software that accidentally duplicated an old signature. The board was not buying it. One of the senior directors, a man known for his ruthless forensic accounting skills, slammed his fist on the table. He grilled Kyle relentlessly, demanding to know how a legacy glitch could perfectly execute a highly specific, newly drafted soil density report bearing my exact cryptographic token, without any matching rough drafts or email trails originating from my verified accounts. Kyle completely froze, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. That was the moment the veteran dispatch manager decided he had suffered enough under Kyle's arrogant incompetence. Quietly, he connected his tablet to the boardroom display. He did not say a word. He simply projected a sequence of internal text messages onto the massive screen. The texts were dated from the previous Tuesday. They were direct orders from Kyle's executive account, explicitly instructing the dispatch team to push the freight first and update the compliance paperwork later, regardless of protocol. The messages explicitly proved Kyle was forcing unverified shipments out the door and scrambling to manufacture the necessary legal documents after the fact. The murmurs around the mahogany table stopped. The board members exchanged dark, knowing glances. The realization hit them collectively. This was not a grieving niece throwing a tantrum. This was a massive, long-term fraudulent management model orchestrated by the chief executive officer and her son. I was merely the first person who had stopped covering for them. I was miles away, but my presence in that room was absolute, exactly 1 hour into their chaos. My private attorney formally served the board with a comprehensive legal demand letter. It was sent directly to their secure inboxes, bypassing Evelyn entirely. We formally requested a completely independent review process. We demanded a third-party audit of all recent compliance documents, a forensic investigation into the unauthorized use of my cryptographic digital signature, and a strict reconciliation of all physical and digital assets currently utilized by Mercer Ridge. We boxed them in completely. They could not move a single truck without my software, and they could not use my software until the fraud was exposed. I sat back in my father's chair, letting the quiet peace of the workshop settle around me. The intricate trap I had laid was snapping shut, exactly as designed, crushing the corruption under its own weight. Then, my encrypted phone buzzed with a direct, unsaved number. I answered cautiously. The voice on the other end was low, measured, and distinctly wealthy. It belonged to the senior director who had grilled Kyle about the signatures. He spoke quickly, ensuring the line was secure. He stated he was bypassing Evelyn and the official corporate channels. He requested a highly confidential, in-person meeting with me that very afternoon. He lowered his voice to a harsh whisper, confessing that after seeing my attorney's demand for an asset reconciliation, he had begun digging into the older financial ledgers. He suspected Evelyn was actively hiding a massive, undisclosed personal loan, secretly secured by the foundational assets of the company itself. He needed my help to find the bottom of the rot. The glass elevators at Sterling and Vance Legal Partners moved with a silent, terrifying speed, depositing me on the 43rd floor overlooking the gray churn of the city river. The senior board member who had called me that morning was waiting in a soundproof corner office. He was accompanied by an independent corporate attorney who looked like he had not slept in 3 days. The director did not waste time with pleasantries. He poured me a glass of water and laid out the stark reality of Mercer Ridge's immediate financial landscape. He revealed that the company was facing a mandatory, comprehensive credit line review scheduled for the start of business on Monday morning. The commercial bank underwriting their daily operations had caught wind of the supply chain freeze. If Evelyn could not definitively prove both the operational capacity to execute the Crown Harbor contract and the flawless legal validity of her compliance history, the bank possessed the unilateral authority to freeze the entire working capital credit line. Mercer Ridge would be functionally bankrupt in less than 72 hours. I reached into my bag and produced the yellowed manila envelope my father had left behind. I slid the ancient capital contribution agreement, the faded bank receipts, and the handwritten list of witness names across the polished marble table. The independent attorney adjusted his glasses and began reading. The room grew incredibly still. As his eyes tracked down the page, his expression shifted from professional curiosity to profound legal horror. He looked up, tapping a gold pen against the document. He explained the catastrophic implication I had only begun to suspect. The massive financial bailout my father had provided decades ago had not just been ignored. Based on the corporate structuring dates aligned with these receipts, it appeared Evelyn had deliberately misclassified his emergency cash injection. Instead of recording it as secured equity or a formal debt obligation, she had likely buried it through a series of shell transactions, effectively erasing the liability from the official ledgers and aggressively diluting the Lawson family share down to zero. She had stolen the company foundation and disguised it as a restructuring write-off. We were currently sitting on a piece of evidence that elevated this from a contract dispute to a massive, multi-decade corporate fraud. I left the law firm with a legally binding agreement that the independent counsel would subpoena the historical ledgers by the end of the day. As I walked out onto the bustling sidewalk, preparing to transition back to the agonizing logistics of planning a burial, my phone buzzed. It was a direct text message from Kyle. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by the frantic bargaining of a cornered animal. He begged for a discreet, face-to-face meeting, promising to settle everything quietly. He hinted at a massive cash payout if I would simply log into the server and restore the authentication protocols before midnight. Following the explicit advice of my attorney, I agreed to meet him. I chose a crowded, brightly lit coffee shop right in the middle of the financial district. I arrived 10 minutes early, ordered a black tea, and initiated a secure voice recording application on my phone, resting it face down on the small circular table. My state legally required only one party to consent to a recording, and I fully consented to capturing my cousin's desperation. Kyle burst through the doors looking completely unhinged. His expensive tie was crooked, his eyes were bloodshot, and he was sweating despite the freezing weather outside. He dropped into the chair opposite me, leaning in close, his voice a frantic, hushed rattle. He bypassed any pretense of apology. He immediately offered me $50,000 in a cashier's check by tomorrow morning. When I simply stared at him, my expression blank, he doubled it to $100,000. He babbled about how the board was breathing down his neck, how his mother was panicking, and how they just needed the trucks to roll. I took a slow sip of my tea. I did not raise my voice. I asked him directly why they could not just push the paperwork through themselves. Considering they had clearly found a way to do it on Tuesday, The pressure completely broke him. The words spilled out of his mouth in a panicked rush. He admitted everything. He confessed that Evelyn had handed him a physical backup security token. One I had decommissioned 2 years ago, but she had secretly kept from the IT desk. He admitted, in clear recorded audio, that his mother had explicitly instructed him to plug it in and use it to forge my digital signature on at least 2 critical compliance addendums to satisfy the state auditor. But he was not done. In his desperate attempt to prove that the situation was fixable, he accidentally dropped the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. He leaned closer, whispering that we could just swap the documents out later. He accidentally mentioned that the company maintained a secondary file vault. It was a completely segregated, hidden shadow drive located outside the main architecture I managed. He confessed that this was where Mercer Ridge stored the altered, heavily sanitized digital scans they used specifically to pass external audits. He had just handed me the map to the evidence. I did not react to the monumental confession. I did not take his money. I did not display a single ounce of anger. I just let the silence stretch between us until his frantic breathing filled the gap. I reached across the table, picked up my phone, and slipped it into my pocket. I looked him dead in the eye, told him I had a funeral to arrange, and walked out of the coffee shop, leaving him completely alone at the table. 2 hours later, the stark fluorescent lights of the corporate world were replaced by the muted, amber glow of the local funeral home. The air smelled heavy with lilies and floor wax. I stood alone in the quiet viewing room. At the far end rested a simple, dark oak casket. I walked slowly down the carpeted aisle, the silence pressing against my eardrums. I stopped at the edge and looked down at my father. His face was peaceful. The deep lines of a hard life smoothed away, but his strong, calloused hands were crossed over his chest, a stark reminder of the man who had built things of real substance, the weight of the day, the staggering scale of the betrayal I had uncovered, pressed down on my shoulders like a heavy beam. Evelyn had not just stolen his money. She had stolen his legacy and then tried to weaponize his death to protect her theft. I placed my hand gently over his. The skin was cold, but the connection was absolute. I took a deep breath, feeling a fierce, unbreakable resolve lock into place inside my chest. I made a silent, unbreakable vow to him right then and there. I would not let them use his passing as a tool for manipulation ever again. The quiet, compliant niece they had exploited for years had died alongside him. Tomorrow, I was going to tear their fraudulent empire down to the studs. The memorial service in Maple Creek was exactly what my father would have wanted. There were no marble halls, no catered receptions, and no forced corporate networking. It was held in a modest brick chapel on a Tuesday afternoon, filled with the quiet murmur of people who actually knew the value of a hard day of work. The pews were packed with his old neighbors, the guys from the local hardware store, and a dozen rough-handed construction workers who had relied on his repaired tools for decades. The air smelled of old wood and impending rain. Noticeably absent was a single representative from the corporate empire he had helped build. Not one person from Evelyn's side of the bloodline bothered to make the 45-minute drive from the city to pay their respects. Halfway through the visitation, a delivery van pulled up to the curb. 2 men struggled to carry in an obscenely large, ostentatious wreath made of rare white orchids and thick gold ribbons. It was a towering corporate monument to hypocrisy. Pinned to the center was a thick card bearing the Mercer Ridge logo, with a handwritten note declaring that family is always family. It was a grotesque performance, designed purely to make Evelyn look benevolent to any outsiders who might be watching, completely ignoring the fact that she had threatened to destroy my livelihood and steal my inheritance barely 48 hours prior. I felt a flash of white-hot anger, but I did not cause a scene. I did not raise my voice or tear the card in half. I simply caught the eye of the funeral director, a kind, soft-spoken man, and quietly requested that the arrangement be moved to the back hallway, completely out of sight. I refused to let the Mercer name cast a shadow over my father's photograph. By the time I returned home that evening, the corporate smear campaign was already in full swing. Evelyn was fighting a desperate war on two fronts, spinning a frantic narrative to both the internal logistics teams and the external supply chain partners. She sent out a company-wide memo and began calling the site managers at the waterfront project, peddling the vicious lie that I was mentally unstable. She claimed the grief of losing my father had triggered a severe psychological breakdown, attempting to frame a highly calculated legal contract dispute as the erratic flailing of an irrational, mourning daughter. She severely underestimated my legal counsel. My attorney did not respond with emotional denials or angry press releases. He responded with a surgical strike of documented facts. He blasted a certified legal timeline directly to the entire board of directors, the commercial bank officers, and the surety bond guarantors. The timeline was cold and irrefutable. It detailed the exact minute of my father's passing, followed by the precise timestamp of my request for a 4-day leave of absence. It included a certified screenshot of Evelyn's text message threatening my job and trust fund. Most damning of all, it mapped the exact hour I discovered the forged cryptographic signature, directly correlated to the legal execution of the software revocation. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that my actions were not a mental break, but a mandatory legal compliance freeze to halt an active federal felony. The timeline broke the board's final line of defense, trapped in a vice grip of pressure from the government clients, the commercial bank threatening to freeze their operational funds, and the bonding company preparing to pull their insurance. The Mercer Ridge directors completely panicked. They bypassed Evelyn's authority entirely. They voted to initiate an expanded, emergency internal hearing scheduled for the very next morning, bringing in independent corporate auditors, and, much to Evelyn's absolute horror, they formally granted me the floor to present my evidence. The walls were closing in on them rapidly. The senior board member I had met at the law firm called me on a secure line. He confirmed that my father's faded receipts had triggered a massive internal investigation. The independent counsel had already found glaring irregularities in the historical capital and asset ledgers, acting on the slip-up Kyle had made in the coffee shop. The board member had officially demanded the immediate legal sealing of the secondary shadow vault, completely freezing Evelyn's ability to purge or alter the fraudulent compliance scans before the auditors arrived. Inside the glass tower, Kyle was beginning to fracture. Word reached me through my quiet network of warehouse allies that he was pacing the hallways, sweating profusely through his expensive shirts, completely unable to focus on damage control. He was caught in an agonizing tug-of-war between his desperate need to protect his mother and a terrifying realization of his own legal exposure. His personal defense attorney, clearly seeing the writing on the wall, was aggressively advising him to secure an immunity deal and cooperate fully before the federal authorities inevitably stepped in to hand out prison sentences for wire fraud. Kyle knew that if he went down with the ship, his mother would gladly let him drown to save herself. It was nearing midnight. The rain had started again, drumming a quiet, steady rhythm against my living room window. I sat at my kitchen table, going over the printed server logs and the licensing agreements one last time, making sure my presentation for the board was entirely bulletproof. I had the forged signature, I had the timeline, I had the leverage. Then, my laptop chimed. A new message appeared in my inbox, originating from a heavily encrypted, anonymous relay address. There was no subject line, no greeting, and no text in the body of the email. There was only a single, high-resolution image file attached. I opened it. It was a photograph of a physical document, an incredibly old, leather-bound accounting ledger page that looked like it had been taken hastily under poor lighting. I zoomed in on the columns of faded ink. My breath caught in my throat. It was a master creditor list from the exact year Mercer Ridge had nearly faced absolute bankruptcy. Right there, on the third line, clearly designated as a priority secured creditor for a massive capital injection, was the name Thomas Lawson. But right beside the photograph of that physical page was a second image, a screenshot of the digitized, official corporate ledger that Evelyn had submitted to the bank years later during her restructuring phase. The line containing my father's name was completely gone. She had not just buried his contribution, she had actively, maliciously erased it from the official financial history to steal his equity and eliminate her debt. Tomorrow morning, I was not just going to shut down their weekend operations, I was going to take the entire company back. The expanded internal hearing felt less like a corporate meeting and more like a federal tribunal. The massive glass boardroom was packed. The entire board of directors sat grim-faced along one side of the mahogany table. Opposite them were the independent auditors, the Mercer Ridge corporate legal team, the very unhappy client representatives from the Crown Harbor project, and the risk managers from the surety firm. My attorney and I took our seats quietly at the far end. Evelyn stood up first. She tried her usual playbook, launching into a theatrical, tearful speech. She painted herself as a grieving sister and accused me of viciously attacking the family business during a time of mourning. She tried to drown the room in emotional manipulation, hoping family loyalty would somehow obscure her glaring legal violations. I did not waste my breath defending my character against her tears. When it was my turn, I simply laid out the chronological facts. I walked them through my initial request for a standard 4-day bereavement leave. Then, my attorney projected Evelyn's written threat onto the main screen. I presented the fully executed master licensing agreement, highlighted the termination clauses, and provided the certified server logs proving a lawful, defensive revocation. Finally, I projected the irrefutable evidence of the forged cryptographic signature on the state compliance documents. The lead independent auditor stood up next, adjusting his glasses. He confirmed my findings to the silent room. His preliminary sweep revealed dozens of delivery confirmations and compliance addendums bearing my unique digital token, all triggered from an IP address registered directly to the executive suite. Furthermore, his team had already breached the secondary shadow server Kyle had foolishly mentioned, uncovering hundreds of heavily doctored digital scans used specifically to pass prior audits at the official mention of the shadow server. Kyle completely cracked. Facing the terrifying reality of personal criminal liability and federal prison time, he threw his mother entirely under the bus. He publicly verified that Evelyn had explicitly ordered him to temporarily forge the signatures to maintain the shipping schedule. He even submitted his own phone to the auditors on the spot, handing over a trove of text messages proving her direct, illegal commands. Evelyn's face turned the color of ash, but the final blow was yet to fall. My attorney stepped forward and distributed thick-bound folders to every board member. Inside were the certified copies of the capital contribution agreements my father had left behind, paired perfectly with the anonymous photograph of the original master ledger and sworn affidavits from 2 retired accounting clerks we had tracked down over the weekend. The evidence was absolute. It proved that the Lawson branch had pumped massive, life-saving capital into the company decades ago. Evelyn had deliberately hidden that debt during a corporate restructuring, entirely erasing my father's secured equity. For my entire adult life, she had not only exploited my labor for free, but she had built her opulent lifestyle directly on top of the stolen financial foundation of my father. The fallout was instantaneous and brutal. The board did not even leave the room to deliberate. They held a live, unanimous vote to immediately suspend both Evelyn and Kyle from all executive duties, stripping their corporate access and triggering an emergency receivership protocol. The chairman then turned to me. His tone entirely changed, practically begging to negotiate a temporary licensing reinstatement to keep the waterfront project afloat. I agreed to provide tightly restricted transitional support, but my terms were merciless. I demanded an exorbitant hourly consulting fee, paid daily, and explicitly stated I was operating strictly as a hostile third-party vendor. I also formally filed a massive civil suit to reclaim the stolen Lawson equity, the decades of unpaid compound interest, and punitive damages for the unauthorized use of my software. The following months were a blur of depositions and aggressive restructuring. Mercer Ridge was completely gutted and reorganized under new management. Evelyn found herself facing a barrage of state and federal investigations for wire fraud, document forgery, and financial misrepresentation. Kyle managed to avoid jail time by signing a sweeping cooperation agreement, effectively exiling himself from the corporate world forever. As for me, the massive financial settlement and the highly lucrative, renegotiated software contracts allowed me to expand Lawson Field Systems into a nationwide logistics powerhouse, finally operating at its true market value. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I drove back out to Maple Creek. The air was crisp and clean. I walked up to the old familiar workshop. In my hands, I held the heavy brass Lawson nameplate, polished until it gleamed like new hardware. I mounted it securely above the heavy steel door. Standing back to look at it, I finally understood what it meant to take everything back. It was never just about the money or the software contracts. It was about reclaiming my father's stolen name. It was about honoring my own relentless hard work. Most importantly, it was about finally establishing the ironclad boundaries I should have built years ago. As the afternoon sun hit the brass, the heavy chains of family obligations simply fell away, and I officially stepped into a life that belonged entirely to me. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know in the comments where you're listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Lily Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and share it so more people can hear it.